Welcome to our channel. This is the tale of Gilles Looney Gratton, the goaltender who never really wanted to stop pucks in the first place, and yet, for a wild stretch of the 1970s, found himself doing exactly that in both the World Hockey Association (WHA) and the National Hockey League (NHL). How did a free-spirited seeker of enlightenment, an unabashed critic of the sport he played, and a faithful devotee of both astrological alignments and transcendental meditation make his way into big league hockey? And more baffling still, how did he leave behind such a notorious, unforgettable legacy in an era teeming with outlandish personalities? If you think you know bizarre hockey tales, trust me, you've never heard one quite like this. Born on July 28, 1952, in Montreal, Gilles Gratton was the fourth of 5 children in a traditional French-Canadian family. His father, Fernand, and mother, Thérèse, had already seen some of their children venture into athletic pursuits. His older brother, Norm, would eventually skate in the NHL himself. But nobody could have guessed the cosmic mischief this middle child would bring to the rink. As a kid, Gilles was slight, creative, and almost completely uninterested in the notion of professional sports. He didn't dream of flying down the ice to score goals, nor did he see himself as a netminder who might stand as the last line of defense for an elite franchise. Instead, young Gilles was content to float through life, indulging in curiosities and passions that would later shape his restless sense of wonder. His improbable journey to the crease began with a quirk of fate. His Pee Wee team's goalie, a boy named Dan Bouchard, was promoted to a higher-level squad, leaving the net wide open. Lacking any better idea, the coaches scanned the bench for a stand-in and saw skinny little Gilles standing there. He was the smallest kid on the team, which, in some twisted logic of youth hockey, made him the perfect candidate to face a barrage of slapshots. The coaches threw him the pads, and Gratton, never one to overthink such matters, simply rolled with it. Little did anyone know that those first goaltending steps would set into motion a baffling tale unlike any other. Giles's immediate skill for the position was undeniable. Despite having zero prior experience in net, his quick reflexes, confident stance, and intuitive reads of oncoming shooters stood out. In youth leagues, people whispered that he was a natural, even if the young man was by no means obsessed with stopping pucks. Over the next few seasons, he proved that raw talent could take you far, but ironically, he never felt the same drive as so many hungry youngsters do. Where others dreamed of wearing a Montreal Canadian sweater under the glow of the Forum's lights, Gratton was already questioning the deeper meaning of it all. A pair of serious concussions during his time in Junior B hockey would only deepen his hesitancy toward the game. Those head injuries required hospital stays, leaving the goalie rattled, both physically and existentially. He began to resent the sport that caused him pain. But fate had other plans. Just when he stood at the brink of quitting altogether, a surprising offer arrived. The Oshawa Generals wanted him. That simple invitation nudged him back onto the ice and toward a destiny that would veer from the mundane to the otherworldly. In Oshawa, Gratton joined a team that counted future NHL stalwarts like Terry O'Reilly, Bob Hound Kelly, and George Ferguson among its ranks. However, in the 1969-70 and 1970-71 seasons, the Generals struggled mightily. Even a decent goalie couldn't make miracles happen on a team that had difficulty defending its zone. So Gratton's numbers, often allowing upwards of 5 goals a game, reflected more on the situation around him than on his individual skill. Yet, behind that battered mask, the seeds of his unique goaltending style were starting to blossom. Part-time brilliance, part-time daydreaming, he continued to perplex observers. By the 1971-72 season, something finally clicked. The Generals posted a vastly improved record of 3.5-1.8-1-0. And Gilles brought his goals against average, GAA, down to a very respectable 3.55. He was named a second-team All-Star in the Ontario Hockey Association, second only to Michel "Bunny" Larocque from the Ottawa 67s. All of a sudden, professional scouts took a keen interest in the quirky netminder from Montreal. The NHL's Buffalo Sabres drafted him in the 5th round of the 1972 draft, and their general manager, the legendary Punch Imlach, waived a modest contract before him. $9,000 for 2 seasons, plus a $5,000 bonus if he signed. The offer was not only meager, it also came with a nearly guaranteed ticket to the minors, something that appealed to Gratton about as much as a protracted dentist's visit. Around the same time, however, a rebellious new league, imaginatively called the World Hockey Association, burst onto the scene to challenge the NHL's hegemony. The Ottawa Nationals of the WA, desperate for any talented goaltender, offered him $25,000 a year for 2 years plus a hearty $20,000 signing bonus. For a guy who repeatedly claimed that his main ambition was to never work a day in his life, the difference between Buffalo's peanuts and Ottawa's generosity was more than enough to swing him. Gratton put pen to paper with the Nationals, forging a new path in a league that was quickly becoming notorious for big contracts, bigger personalities, and a freewheeling style of play that made the 1970s in the NHL look downright conservative. In Ottawa, Giles shared the crease with veteran Les Binkley, a savvy netminder who had seen more than his fair share of pucks in the minors and the Pittsburgh Penguins. The rest of the Nationals roster was a hodgepodge of minor league regulars, long shots, and a few fading veterans. But to everyone's pleasant surprise, Gratton excelled. He posted a 2.5223 record and kept his GAA at a solid 3.71, which for a rookie in a brand new league was no small feat. He wasn't exactly living a purist's professional athlete lifestyle, but the openness of the WA gave Gratton enough breathing room to explore his varied interests. He thrived under less rigid organizational structures. Even though the team got knocked out in the first round by the New England Whalers, who would go on to win the league championship, Giles shone with a 52-save performance in one of the games. The press recognized him as a future star in the making, if only he'd keep his head in the game long enough to refine his talent. That first season also acted as a preview for the zany escapades to come, because while most rookies dreamed of being singled out for all-star teams and recognition, Gratton was more enthusiastic about having time to party, to skip practices when it suited him, or, if rumors are to be believed, to run around rinks in nothing but his birthday suit. One highlight in his second season, when the Nationals relocated to Toronto and rebranded themselves as the Toros, was an incident that might, or might not, have served as inspiration for the film Slapshot. Apparently, Gratton decided to skate around the practice rink in the nude, cackling with delight and baffling both teammates and staff. To hear him tell it, it was just a bit of harmless fun, but it also showcased the free-spirited, devil-may-care approach that made him a legend. His new location in Toronto brought a brighter spotlight, increased press attention, and more interviews where he revealed a personality so out of sync with typical jock culture that you couldn't help but watch in fascination. In the Toros' first season, 1973-74, Gratton posted a 3.53 GAA in 57 games. He even earned a mid-season invite to replace the injured Al Smith in a WA All-Star game, proving that under the right circumstances, he could excel with the best. On the ice, the Toros performed commendably, finishing near the top of their division and making a respectable run in the playoffs before bowing out to the Chicago Cougars. Off the ice, though, Giles was grabbing headlines for his outlandish behavior and comments. Journalists flocked to him, hungry for weird and witty quotes, and Gratton never disappointed. He laid out, with guileless honesty, his many unconventional hobbies and beliefs. He talked freely about his interest in reincarnation, telling reporters that he remembered past lives in remarkable detail, once claiming that he had been a physician in Germany, and at another time, a soldier in Spain. He believed wholeheartedly in the power of astrology, so much so that he once refused to take the net if the moon happened to be in an unfavorable position, advising his coaches that cosmic rhythms did not align with him playing hockey that night. Yet it was his stance on hockey itself that shook people up the most. In a famous interview with writer Roy McGregor, Gratton admitted he hated the sport. He saw it as a violent, trivial pursuit of chasing a small piece of rubber around, risking grievous bodily harm in the process. He viewed it merely as a means to an end, a well-paying gig that would allow him to float through life on his own schedule. He wasn't exaggerating. He insisted that while he loved to win when he was on the ice, he had zero desire for the grind and discipline that came with professional sports, and he bemoaned the brutality of shot blocking, cross-checks, and general hockey madness. This viewpoint was so radical in the mid-1970s that it earned him both fans and enemies. Some called him lazy and ungrateful. Others admired his honesty and carefree spirit. Hockey, after all, is a demanding sport that can chew up even the most devoted players. Hearing someone openly say they loathed playing yet still laced up for a healthy paycheck and a chance to explore life's bigger mysteries was guaranteed to stir controversy. Not that the Toros minded controversy, especially when they made big splashes in the offseason. In an eye-opening move that signaled the WHA's willingness to chase big names, the Toros signed two established NHL superstars, Frank Mahovlich and Paul Henderson, fresh off his heroics in the 1972 Summit Series. They also managed to snag Czech defector Václav Nedomanský. Meanwhile, Buffalo tried to woo Gratton with a new contract. The result was a bidding war that left him with an eye-popping 5-year deal in Toronto, worth around $101,000 per season, plus a $100,000 signing bonus and the use of a snazzy Porsche 911S Targa. One can scarcely imagine a more perfect deal for a self-proclaimed anti-establishment free spirit. Big money, a fancy sports car, and no immediate demands that he drastically change his unorthodox lifestyle. If anything, the Toros seemed content to let the unpredictable goalie do his thing as long as he delivered results when it counted. Unfortunately, that's where the cosmic vibes started to tilt. The 1974-75 season saw a strong Toros lineup that should have competed for a WHA championship. Early on, Gilles maintained solid form. He had found a supportive head coach in Billy Harris, who seemed to understand that pushing or reprimanding Gratton too hard might send him packing to a meditation retreat in India. Their unspoken arrangement was that if Gilles wanted to indulge in bizarre behaviors or skip a practice here and there, that was fine, as long as he showed up and performed. But when Harris resigned mid-season for personal reasons, the Toros replaced him with Bobby Leduc, a decision that rattled Gratton's calm. He disliked authority figures who demanded discipline, especially ones he didn't personally respect. By the time the playoffs rolled around, Gilles was unraveling. The Toros faced the San Diego Mariners in the quarterfinals, and Gratton's meltdown reached its climax. After allowing 5 goals in 2 periods in Game 1, he lost the starting job. Feeling unappreciated and psychologically unprepared, he refused to re-enter the net, telling the new coach in explicit terms to keep him off the ice. Rather than regroup with the team, he took off to a local watering hole, indulged heavily, and never came back. His teammates, furious at what they saw as a betrayal, voiced resentment that would linger for years. Shortly after, the Toros, exhausted and undermanned, bowed out of the series. If you were a rational observer, you'd assume this fiasco would be the last straw for any professional franchise. But the 1970s were a different time. Later that summer, the NHL's St. Louis Blues acquired Gratton's rights from Buffalo and offered him a 6-year contract at $90,000 per year. Still decent money for an NHL goalie. For a moment, it appeared that he might get a fresh start, a chance to put the bitterness of Toronto behind him. However, upon arriving at the NHL draft in Montreal, he crossed paths with an old friend from Oshawa, Gary Young, who was about to be named head coach of the Blues. Gilles, being Gilles, greeted Young cheerfully, albeit with a commentary about not caring in the slightest about playing, as long as they paid me. You can probably guess where that landed him once Gary Young took the reins. From the outset, their relationship was poisonous. Though Gratton suited up for 6 games, finishing with a decent 2.49 GAA, he also faked or exaggerated injuries 3 times, leaving the Blues in the lurch. When he took a puck to the elbow early in a game against the Islanders and promptly abandoned the crease, the Blues decided they'd had enough. Back in an era without the internet or viral social media, Gratton's escapades still found a way to overshadow typical headlines. Accusations flew that Coach Young was prejudiced against French-Canadian players. Gratton felt singled out for his heritage and lifestyle. Whether or not there was truth to that, the real casualty was his playing time. Jilted in St. Louis, Gilles had nowhere else to go. The old Toros weren't about to greet him with open arms after the previous year's meltdown, so once again, he decided, why not Florida? His favorite refuge, a place he could meditate, work on his music, and generally ignore the daily grind of professional hockey. He assumed his career might be finished, and by then, many observers assumed the same. Surely no one would take a flyer on a man so openly disdainful of the game. But the 1970s, especially in professional hockey, were a decade when nearly any scenario could still happen if a GM was desperate enough. Enter John Ferguson, GM of the New York Rangers, who made the kind of decision that only a gambler at heart might make. offering Gratton a 3-year contract to back up the young, talented John Davidson. Arriving in New York, Giles discovered a Rangers team that had gone off the rails in 1975-76. They missed the playoffs and needed new energy. But to insert new energy, you need a player who's committed at the bare minimum. Gratton was so far from committed that he treated each practice, each game day, as an opportunity to conjure fresh reasons to bow out. He disliked the stifling atmosphere and the pressure from fans in a major market like Manhattan. He began partying more, smoking marijuana daily by his own admission, and even making weird references to his past life as an executioner in Spain who threw rocks at the condemned. Giles insisted that every puck fired at him triggered the karmic memory of those stones coming back at him, a cosmic payback, if you will. Not exactly the motivational speech a coach or GM wants to hear. Sometimes, when pressed to start a game, he'd claim that the stars or the moon were misaligned, and if forced to play, he'd allow double-digit goals just out of cosmic sabotage. This, mind you, was the environment in which that famous mask was unveiled, forever changing his brand from that weird goalie from Canada to the guy with the ferocious, hand-painted tiger mask. It happened on January 30, 1977, against the St. Louis Blues, fittingly enough, his old team. He had gone through multiple masks already that year, none particularly memorable, but when he skated onto the ice that night wearing a roaring tiger's face on his mask, the crowd exploded in cheers and laughter. Even the officials momentarily halted the game just to get a closer look at it, and opposing players huddled around to marvel at the bold artwork. In a single moment, Gratton went from an NHL afterthought to a permanent fixture in the hockey imagination. Even decades later, fans still rank that mask among the most iconic in the sport's entire history, a testament not just to the artistry but also to the persona behind it. Sadly, that tiger's roar didn't save his career. The Rangers remained a chaotic squad in the 1976-77 season, missing the playoffs yet again. Gratton finished 1-1-1-8-7, with a bloated 4.22 GAA, and incurring the wrath of John Ferguson, who publicly declared that Giles's performance was not NHL caliber. In truth, the man in net was more focused on ephemeral pursuits, partying, music, meditative practices, than improving his technique or dedicating himself to daily workouts. The final straw came on March 10, 1977, when he straight up refused to start against the Boston Bruins because, in his words, the stars didn't align properly. Staring in disbelief, the coaching staff had to scramble for a replacement. That replacement, rookie Dave Totteran, let in 6 goals in the first period and would never play in the NHL again. From that point forward, Giles's time in the big leagues was on borrowed moments. Come training camp in 1977, he and Ferguson butted heads yet again, with Gratton calling the GM a liar to the press. That was all Ferguson needed. Giles was promptly placed on waivers, went unclaimed, and was shipped off to the New Haven Nighthawks in the American Hockey League. He played exactly 1 game there, a 6-1 shellacking courtesy of the Binghamton Dusters, and then famously told a reporter that New Haven felt like a prison, albeit a well-paying prison, and that as long as they sent him checks, he was content to do nothing. With that, the Rangers suspended him, eventually buying out his contract. Astonishingly, Giles had gone from being touted as a potential Ken Dryden-level talent to a man collecting checks while refusing to guard any creases. He was 25 years old, with an entire future ahead of him, but his story in professional hockey had all but ended. From there on out, he vanished from the hockey world's radar for many years. He briefly surfaced in the 1990s, not as a goaltender but as a photographer covering the World Ice Hockey Championships in Europe, an ironic twist for someone who once despised the sport. He also worked at a Canadian auction house that specialized in sports memorabilia, no doubt crossing paths with old photos or equipment from an era he once inhabited. Much later, he collaborated with writer Greg Oliver to produce a memoir titled Gratton, the Looney, a tongue-in-cheek nod to the moniker that had followed him around for decades. His stories, as you might expect, are part comedic gold, part baffling confessions, and entirely enthralling to anyone who relishes the kind of candor that big league sports almost never allow. For fans and teammates who remember him, the question remains: was Gilles Gratton merely a harmless, offbeat entertainer who played up the Looney shtick for laughs? Or was he a destructive, self-sabotaging presence who undermined the stability and success of every franchise he touched? The answer, most likely, lies somewhere in between. Oddly enough, many of his old colleagues recall him with a strange fondness, the way you might remember a wild, rebellious cousin who shows up to family events and stirs up chaos but is also the life of the party. He never pretended to be what he wasn't. From day one, he declared his hatred for the rigors of the sport and the pointlessness, in his view, of practicing daily just to stand in front of vulcanized rubber missiles. In his heart of hearts, Gilles aspired to be the ultimate drifter, unbound by routine or expectations, free to noodle on the piano, which he taught himself to play without formal lessons, or jam on the guitar with friends, or research his reincarnation theories. Hockey itself was in flux. The NHL had doubled in size from the original 6 days, absorbing teams like Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, Minnesota, Oakland, and St. Louis, which in turn opened up a talent shortage. The WA swooped in, offering large sums to entice players away from the stifling hierarchy of old-school NHL clubs. With that competition came a sense of desperation. GMs were perpetually on the hunt for new prospects, new angles, anything that might give them an edge in the wide-open, free-for-all environment. That allowed a mercurial presence like Gratton to find plenty of suitors willing to shrug off the warning signs and sign him to significant contracts. This confluence of factors, expansion, a rival league, a changing culture in which the 70s vibe, championed self-expression, enabled Gilles to indulge in behaviors that, in any other decade, would have ended his career in an instant. Looking back at his story, it might be tempting to label Gilles Gratton a comedic side character in hockey's grand narrative, nothing more than a wacky footnote overshadowed by the legendary talents of his time. But that would ignore the glimpses of brilliance he displayed. With the Oshawa Generals, he snagged that second-team All-Star honor. In the WA, he stood toe-to-toe with bigger, stronger pros and delivered rock-solid performances, even earning All-Star recognition in place of the injured Al Smith. He had the reflexes, the instincts, and the positional smarts to excel. Coaches and teammates, for all their griping about his work ethic, often admitted that if Gratton had ever dedicated himself the way other athletes do, he might have been truly great. But that was never his goal. Perhaps his greatest success was fulfilling the vow he made early on, to live in such a way that no one could ever say he worked, in the conventional sense. If, when they put me in the ground, someone can say I never worked a day in my life, he once proclaimed, then I'll have accomplished what I set out to do. Even the matter of that famed tiger mask, so inextricably linked to his legend, epitomizes the spontaneity he brought to the rink. It wasn't meticulously planned by marketers, nor was it a scheme to garner attention in a time before social media's existence. It came from an idle look at a National Geographic magazine, a bolt of inspiration that drove him to ask an artist acquaintance to decorate a plain mask with a fierce tiger's face. The results were so striking that they sparked a communal gasp in Madison Square Garden. Opposing skaters, accustomed to the standard white or minimally painted masks, found themselves momentarily disarmed by this whimsical expression of personal style. That mask remains on numerous greatest goalie masks of all time lists, testifying that in a sport so reliant on tradition, personality can make an indelible mark if it's daring enough. It's also worth considering how times have changed for professional athletes. Modern sports culture is full of personal trainers, nutritionists, mental health coaches, and brand managers. Today, an eccentric figure like Gilles Gratton might be coached into harnessing his quirks more productively, or at least channeling them into a personal brand that fosters a following and garners endorsement deals. There's even a slight possibility that a team could accommodate his spiritual beliefs and unique mental approach, integrating them as part of a progressive sports psychology program. However, in the 1970s, especially in the gritty realm of hockey, with its old-school mentalities, compromise between a star-gazing, pot-smoking, reincarnation-believing netminder and the management's demand for consistency was difficult to envision. The stories that swirl around him paint a picture of a man who had the talent to thrive in an era starved for good goaltending but lacked the desire and discipline to do so. Instead, he ended up a rebellious shooting star, burning bright in short bursts before leaving a trail of frustration in his wake. His abrupt departure from the game barely caused a ripple in the hockey headlines of the late 1970s, which is ironic given the bigger fuss he'd caused when he was active. Gratton disappeared into the next phase of his life, which included traveling, playing music, dabbling in photography, and, presumably, continuing to explore spiritual and philosophical questions in his own unhurried way. Hockey fans largely forgot him, until, on occasion, someone would unearth a photo of that mesmerizing tiger mask. Then, inevitably, a younger fan would ask, "Who was that guy, anyway?" Leading to hushed retellings of nude skate sessions, cosmic disclaimers to coaches, and wild nights spent far from the disciplined regime of a professional athlete. The revival of interest in vintage hockey, via classic auctions, old highlight reels, and online fan communities, offered Gratton a mild resurgence in public consciousness. People who had never seen him play live stumbled upon his story and found themselves entranced by a goalie who claimed he'd rather read star charts than practice, who actively disliked everything about his profession, yet ended up immortalized through a single piece of goalie gear. The storyline felt too fantastical to be true, but the countless quotes and anecdotes from ex-teammates, reporters, and coaches confirm that if anything, the real stories are even more outrageous than the rumors. Naturally, critics wonder what might have been if Gratton had harnessed even half his potential, ignoring the cosmic omens and focusing on perfecting his craft. Could he have carved out a place among the NHL's better goalies of the 1970s? Might he have been the difference maker on those skill-laden Toros squads? It's one of hockey's many what-if debates. But Giles, for his part, never sounded like he had any regrets. He viewed it all as a comedic farce, a journey he was more or less roped into by skill and circumstance. If the ride netted him enough money to maintain a lifestyle free from the clutches of a 9-to-5 grind, then it was worth enduring the aggravations of coaches and front offices. And when the frustration overcame the enjoyment, he simply walked away, confident that the next chapter of his life would be more fulfilling. So here we are, decades after Looney Gratton's final pro game, still fascinated by the man behind the mask. His tale underscores the sheer unpredictability of sports, where not every athlete is driven by championships, trophies, and professional pride. For some, it's a stepping stone to personal ambitions that exist far outside the rink. It also reminds us of the kaleidoscopic nature of the 1970s, an era that championed self-expression and rebellion. There was no better decade for a personality like Gilles Gratton to emerge, flourish briefly, and vanish. Had he been born in a different time, or played in a different league, the world might never have been treated to that blend of cosmic insight, brazen honesty, and comical disregard for hockey's sacred traditions. And for those who loved the game then, and still cherish it now, that's part of the magic. Not everyone can be a Wayne Gretzky, a Bobby Orr, or a Ken Dryden. The outliers add spice, weaving fables that become the stuff of barroom legends and nostalgic YouTube highlights. People argue about whether Gratton was a bad teammate, or a lovable nut, but nearly all who encountered him agree on one point. There was nobody else quite like him. And it's that uniqueness that resonates across the decades. If you see a photograph of that vivid tiger mask, you might find it impossible not to smile. You might even ask yourself what it would be like to have talent so immense that you can blow off entire practices, cling to a vow never to really work, yet still slip into the major leagues, leaving a comedic path of unforgettable stories in your wake. Hockey fans still share second-hand tales about Gilles Looney Gratton, describing the day he told a coach that the Moon's position would force him to give up 15 goals if he were forced to play. Or recounting how he described in detail the glimpses of his so-called past lives, from a German doctor to a Spanish soldier, with unwavering conviction that these were real memories. Teammates roll their eyes yet break into smirks when they talk about how he brazenly outran them in certain netminding drills one day, only to claim a totally fabricated injury the next. The paradox is that he commanded grudging respect for being so unapologetically himself, even if himself meant refusing to show up when it mattered most. In the decades since, sports journalists, comedic writers, and old teammates have each tried to define the legacy of Gilles Looney Gratton. Some are harsh, blaming him for letting down entire rosters. Others are amused and view him as a harmless oddball. The man himself appears comfortable in the role he played. Though his name might not loom large on the official list of greatest goaltenders, a dedicated corner of hockey lore will forever keep him alive as the brilliant, astrological, rebellious talent behind that one-of-a-kind mask. And his impact, while fleeting, has trickled into the culture. Other goalies have taken to more elaborate mask designs, showcasing their individuality. While he certainly wasn't the only netminder to experiment with a distinctive look, he was among those who realized the mask could transcend practicality and become an extension of the goalie's character. His memoir, Gratton the Looney, co-written with Greg Oliver, ensures that future generations can dive deep into his perspective, although it may leave readers with more questions than answers. What's true? What's exaggerated? Where does the cosmic swirl end and the factual timeline begin? In typical Gilles Gratton fashion, he tells you just enough to pique your curiosity, always leaving you a little uncertain if he's in on the joke or if he's simply existing on a different plane of reality. Yet, what remains consistent is the sense that he never apologized for who he was. He shirked the athletic norms of his day. He gave brash interviews, rummaging for deeper meaning in a career built on reflexes and physical skill. And then, at the apex of frustration, he walked away, no regrets in tow, confident the money he made would allow him to float from experience to experience without ever being pinned down to a job title. In retrospect, you might say his only real team was himself, a singular figure draped in 1970s flamboyance, wandering from Montreal to Oshawa, from Ottawa to Toronto, from St. Louis to New York, and finally into the ephemeral beyond. Now, decades after he posted his final stats, we're left to unravel a legend that feels almost mythic. He was the goaltender who hated hockey, the reluctant star who'd rather chase spiritual awakenings than 100-mile-per-hour slapshots, the party-loving free spirit who contradicted so many attitudes of the macho hockey culture around him. And ironically, by being so outrageously distinct, he ended up leaving a deeper impression than many players who quietly did their jobs well and never rocked the boat. So what do we take from Gilles Gratton's story? Perhaps a reminder that professional sports, for all their glory, can sometimes be just another job in the eyes of the participant. Or maybe a testament to the fact that star alignments, reincarnation, and naked skate sessions can indeed coexist with respectable goals against averages, albeit briefly. His career arc suggests that not every talented athlete is motivated by trophies or pure admiration. Some are motivated by the simplest goal imaginable: money in their pocket and the freedom to roam. That approach might rub fans and management the wrong way, particularly in a sport that celebrates grit, dedication, and respect for the team. But it also highlights a seldom discussed truth. Even in professional sports, every so often you get an individual who just doesn't think like the rest. They slip through the cracks, sign big contracts, deliver entertaining narratives, and disappear as abruptly as they arrived. Not every hockey hero is measured by Stanley Cups or Hall of Fame plaques. Some are measured by the echo of their personalities, by how persistently their name resurfaces whenever someone brings up the strangest, most entertaining figures to grace the ice. Gratton might not have a storied career replete with ring ceremonies or accolades, but he has a hold on the imaginations of fans who yearn for color in a game that can otherwise get lost in plain whiteboards and cliché interviews. He'll remain the star-laced enigma who glimpsed professional success, laughed at its demands, occasionally performed feats of brilliance, and glided away on his own terms. As we wrap up this odyssey, recall that final McGregor interview from early in Gratton's career, where he spelled out his objective quite plainly. "I hope when they lay me in my grave, there's someone there who can say Gratton never worked a day in his life. If someone can say that about me, then I'll have achieved what I set out to achieve. I've already worked out my marker. Here lies King Floater. Never worked a day in his life, but he was happy." Seldom do we find a professional athlete so transparent in their anti-career ambition, so honest about their aims. It's a quote that, in retrospect, summarizes the life and times of Gilles Gratton in near poetic precision. He was King Floater, drifting through the 1970s hockey scene, picking up checks, enthralling onlookers, and leaving us stories that we're still repeating today. So whether you love or hate his approach, whether you think it's a shame that such talent was wasted or a triumphant affirmation of individual freedom, there's no denying that Gilles Gratton injected something wonderful and unpredictable into the fabric of the sport. In the galaxy of hockey stories, Gilles Looney Gratton was that rogue comet that burned past conventional wisdom, and we're still watching his trail with awe and mischievous grins. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more like it.